I was just thinking about one of the things that Representative Buck was saying was about, what this means for competition and speech at the same time. And there are a lot of interesting interplay there. I'm wondering, Daphne, if you can start out and take us through, this question about how users' content is treated online. Is that something that is affected by competition, or do those things fight against each other?
Sure. So one of the confounding factors here is that if platforms just hosted everything that users wanted to say online, or even everything that's legal to say, everything that the First Amendment permits, you would get this sort of cesspool or mosh pit of online speech that most people don't actually want to see. Users would run away, advertisers would run away. We wouldn't have functioning platforms for civic discourse. And so something that all of the major platforms and the smaller emerging ones like Gab or Parler wind up doing is engaging in content moderation and taking down some content that's legal but that's causing problems for the platform. And I think bottom line, there's not really a left-right divide on whether that's a good idea, because nobody actually wants, nothing but porn and bullying and pro-anorexia content and other, dangerous or garbage content all the time on the internet. But when we have only a very small number of large platforms engaging in that kind of moderation, that creates a huge amount of power in private hands over the places where we all go to seek information and to speak our minds. And so I think there's a very deep connection between the questions about online speech and content moderation and the questions about competition and whether we want a greater diversity of rule sets that we can choose to live under for our online speech.
Yeah, I'm wondering, we've seen a real tide turn here now, and we have Facebook and Google have both said they back the idea of some reforms to Section 230. Dane, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what sort of changes you see as viable.
Well, I think I want to go back to something that the congressman said just for a second. I'll get to your question.
Absolutely.
we were talking about competition, and everyone kept saying there are four major companies. There are more than that, of course, as we all know. So there is competition. I mean, the four large social media platforms, they compete every day with one another. So the issue of is there competition out there? I think the answer to that question is yes. The way we can get agreement, I think you asked the congressman, can you get an agreement with the left on this issue? The way we get agreement is how do we have to agree on the problem we're trying to solve. And that's where we see this schism going left and right, because we have many proposals that are out there and they compete with one another and they have different effects. We have to also remember this impacts the consumer. I hear a lot about, the companies. We cannot forget about the end user who will be impacted more significantly than any one company if we start neutering 230 to the degree that's been suggested by some others. So your question was, what do we see happening for 230? I think is what you asked.
Well, what do you think is a logical or viable reform?
Well, I think one thing, the fact that we're at the 25th anniversary of Section 230, it does make sense that we take a look at this. For reform, we need to do it carefully, keeping a keen eye on identifying the problem to be solved, think through all the unintended consequences for users and industries. This 230 does not just impact tech. It impacts ISPs, impacts libraries and universities. A lot of people utilize 230 to be able to do what they want to do, and most importantly, it impacts consumers. When you think about it, things like self-publishing, crowdsourcing, Wikipedia, how-to videos, all those things are impacted by any kind of significant neutering of Section 230. So what I would say is remember that why the law was created, which was to give users the opportunity to be able to produce anything they want to produce, and also safeguard companies from being responsible or liable for what an individual user does.
Now, I'd love to turn next to Adam. I'm wondering, do you see a need for any updates to Section 230?
No, I don't think Section 230 needs to be fixed. I think it needs a publicist. I think people, policymakers included, ought to have I think, a more fulsome appreciation of what 230 does and the kind of ways in which 230 helps make the internet better. Look, if you took away 230, you would give companies like two bad options: to either turn into Disneyland or turn into a wasteland. Either turn into a very highly curated experience where only certain people have the ability to post content, or turn into a wasteland where essentially anything goes because a company fears legal liability. And I think, unfortunately, we see a cautionary tale in the legal mess that was created by the last time Congress tried to, quote unquote, fix Section 230, which was FOSTA SESTA. FOSTA SESTA has not aged well. It's proven to be a cautionary tale about supposedly narrow Section 230 changes that end up having a big impact. It was intended to provide a narrow carve-out, but in fact, what's happened is it's been rarely used to prosecute trafficking. It's helped drive consensual sex work underground. And it has a knowledge standard that essentially brings us back to the moderator's dilemma that really spurred Section 230 to be enacted in the first place. So, which again discourages sites from conducting reasonable moderation for their sites. Frankly, we see a similar dynamic with Senator Klobuchar's bill carving out health misinformation from Section 230. That ignores the fact that Twitter, Facebook, they've been sued by anti-vaxxers for their posts being removed. The companies have then won those lawsuits on Section 230 grounds. For Senator Klobuchar, President Biden, people who want a better internet, they have to realize that Section 230 has helped enable that. So let's learn from FOSTA as the last Section 230 reform. Carving up Section 230 for pet causes is going to create more problems, not solve them.
Now it's interesting to me because, of course, Chamber of Progress is center left, supporting a progressive technological future. How do you have these conversations with Democrats and progressives who are looking at the amount of misinformation on these platforms and saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying about dangers, but obviously what we've got right now is not working?
I think they fail to appreciate the ways in which Section 230 has been used by platforms to make those platforms better. There were cases several years ago where Twitter kicked off a white supremacist, Jared Taylor. Taylor sued Twitter. Twitter successfully defended itself using Section 230. So you see this kind of thing. Look, I think the platforms generally have an interest in making their platforms a healthy place to be where people want to spend time. That requires moderation, and moderation is what's enabled by Section 230. So I think that to the extent that a lot of even health misinformation, again, what I find is that most of the things that people on the left and right want to see from social media, Section 230 enables that. It enables more competition. It enables voices outside the mainstream. It encourages, I think, better individual behavior online because it holds individuals responsible. And frankly, I think it helps clean up the internet and make it better, enables platforms to make the internet better.
I also would add that, we don't get credit for what we actually are doing. I mean, the fact that Facebook has taken down over 20 million pieces of content and YouTube has removed over 1 million videos that have misinformation and disinformation, all that is happening now, not to mention what we're doing, particularly on COVID-19, to promote vaccinations and vaccines. So I think the industry needs to get a lot of credit for what they're doing as well.
Well, now, we do have other models to look at, right? The U.S. is the only country with a Section 230. Other countries have online forums and manage them without that. Daphne, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about what the differences are there.
Sure. So I've, practiced law under non-U.S. systems for 15 years. So I've seen a lot of variations in, what it looks like out there without CDA 230 and what it could look like here, if we were to make changes. And there are a whole lot of lessons that we need to pay attention to. And the main one being that once you go down the road of having platforms take down anything that might be illegal or that creates legal risk for them, their incentive is to err on the side of just taking down anything that is controversial, taking down perhaps things like Me Too posts because somebody might claim that they're defamatory. So there's this huge issue with a margin of over removal. We also have a growing body of studies showing that particularly when platforms rely on automated means to moderate speech, that margin of over removal, of taking down the wrong stuff, doesn't fall on everybody equally. It has a disparate impact on, for example, people speaking African American dialectic English. So there's this huge set of problems that comes with taking away the immunity that 230 provides. Now, there are a bunch of systems that try to redress those. What the EU is in the process of moving toward is something that actually looks a fair amount like the DMCA in the United States, having this sort of choreographed notice and takedown system where users are notified about if their content's been taken down and given an opportunity to appeal and so forth. That involves a bunch of trade-offs as well, though. I had a op-ed in The Hill in January kind of pointing out the things in Europe's pending legislation that I think are worth paying attention to in the US. If we were to move away from CDA 230, for example, we definitely should not have one-size-fits-all rules that apply to Facebook and also to their smallest competitors. That is likely to be a recipe for rules that only Facebook can follow. Similarly, we should not have rules that were designed with social media in mind, but then courts are going to be asked to apply them to the infrastructure providers in the guts of the internet. The rules for one kind of technology providers won't make sense for another one. So there are a lot of lessons from systems outside the US, but many of them are that they have really significant downsides that we avoid through 230 here. But for the reasons that Adam was saying, because it enables content moderation, it kind of builds the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure for platforms to do the things that so many people are asking them to do.
Yeah, the one thing that we do end up with here, though, is sites that actually facilitate illegal content and use Section 230 as a shield as well. One of the proposals is to have, the protection for companies to act in good faith is often called the Good Samaritan rule, right? There's a proposal to have a Bad Samaritan provision that would go after companies that don't take some sort of reasonable measures. I'm wondering, Dane, would you have any thoughts on that?
I think any behavior that's illegal offline should be illegal online as well. And I think we work every day, our member companies work every single day, and I represent everyone from Airbnb to ZipRecruiter, work every day to make sure that everything we do everything on our sites is legal. Now, it's a major job, and as I think you pointed out with Congressman Buck, some companies have a big staff to be able to do that, and smaller companies don't. So we need to make sure there's flexibility in the business model that's out there. So when we talk about reforming 230, we want to make sure that we do it if anything is needed, and when we identify the problem, it is done in a way that impacts individual companies and allows them to grow their businesses the way they need to do that. And right now, my concern is that when you start talking about neutering 230, you're really going to impact today's modern public square of how we have more information out there. And particularly as you hear conversations about conservative speech and bias and progressive speech, our goal is it is in our financial interest to have more people using our platforms, not fewer. So we want to make sure we have a place where everyone can find their tribe. And I think that's what we're providing right now. And tinkering with 230 through carve-outs and through, as some suggested, just major overhaul and do away with it, that will limit that speech, not increase it.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you're saying, go for it.
No, I think you make a good point about, what other tools, because I think one of the things that's really important is that federal law enforcement essentially shut down Backpage through other laws, right? They didn't need Section 2. They didn't need FOSTA to do that, right? And similarly, there's a case, a notorious case, Herrick versus Grindr, that was brought against Grindr involving harassment. A man's ex-boyfriend was doing some really terrible things to him. He lost the case against Grindr, frankly, on 230 grounds. But what ended up happening, which has not been reported on much, is that after that happened, the New York Police Department convicted, or the New York District Attorney convicted the harassing ex-boyfriend for harassment. The guy spent 1.5 years in jail. So, I think there are ways to sort of get at the behavior. Senator Wyden's been exploring, for example, the idea of expanding criminal penalties for things like election-related disinformation. Let's look at solutions like that.
And picking up where Adam left off, the Grindr case is exactly an illustration that everything that is not a 230 issue. I've seen there are several bills that are out there across the states. We have 28 bills introduced this year and 33 draft bills, and they range from everything from children's mental health to cyberbullying. Everything is not a 230 issue. That's why it is critically important that we define the problem we're trying to solve. And that will help, I think, bring all sides together to figure out how do we find a solution, or is it some other solution? In the Grindr case, that clearly there were laws that were available for that individual, for that young man who was being harassed, and thankfully the police reacted to it.
Yeah, you mentioned all the legislation. I think it's 20 bills this year. And I'm wondering, there are those that call for repeal that I think everyone knows don't really have that enough support. But I'm wondering, Daphne, if you could lead us through any of those that you think might have some reasonable executable provisions.
Sure. So, I mean, the law that I think is the most well-informed by understanding how content moderation works in the real world is the PACT Act, which it doesn't try to focus on saying, hey, platforms, you take down the following or don't take down this other thing. It's not a top-down dictate about online speech. Instead, it is saying, hey, platforms, you need to have a process. If there is a court that has adjudicated that something is defamatory, then you need to take it down. If you are enforcing your own rules, you need to be clear with users about what they are. That, to me, is sort of the most viable approach. It's similar to the European approach that I was talking about earlier. And it stands in pretty stark contrast to proposals that seem to be trying to use congressional power to get platforms to get rid of speech that may be awful, maybe something that I hate and maybe all of you hate, but that happens to be First Amendment protected. And so it's not within Congress's power to try to act against it. And the problem with those bills isn't some philosophical dispute about what speech should be allowed. The problem with those bills is that lawmakers are trying to use their political capital to pass something that's likely to get struck down by courts. And that's not a good use of anybody's time. So focusing on the things that are doable and that are more process oriented, I think is the right area to focus in.
Well, we've had a shortened conversation, but it has been great. Before we wrap up, though, let's go back to that audience question I asked at the start. It was, out of the proposed changes to Section 230, what do you think will be most effective? Here's what you guys had to say. 51% say leave it alone. 26% say we want new obligations on companies. 10% narrowing the categories of speech protected. 8% repeal Section 230 as a whole. And 5% put limits on protections that give companies latitude to take down that content. Does anybody have any reactions to those results? Were any surprising to you?
They're not surprising to me. I mean, I think if you start looking at this in a rational way, you begin to see the benefits that 230 has provided. I mean, no one should want to destroy or what we have has grown over the past 25 years. 230 has been a tremendous asset to the growth of the internet for users, for companies, and for everyone alike. So I'm not surprised by it. And I think if it's 51%, I think, doesn't that mean that wins the day?
It speaks very well of the Politico Live audience. Clearly, the Politico Live audience is very well informed. It would never submit to 230 derangement syndrome.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you, Dane, Adam, and Daphne, for joining us for the panel. Now, Kathy Bouty, our Senior Vice President at Politico, is up next with a conversation with Julia White, the Chief Marketing Officer of SAP. Following that, Politico tech reporter Alexandra Levine is going to be talking to U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, the chair of the subcommittee on competition policy, antitrust, and consumer rights.